Welcome. Welcome again to another Crack Open the Book Short, where we just have a little bit of your time as we talk about the Bible. Remember, the Bible is not hard to understand if we follow the rules of language. Today, teaching the gospel, the foundation. We've already explored some of the fundamental principles, and we remind those to ourselves as we look at the specific steps of how to teach the gospel from a biblical, connective way, a flowchart way, if you'd like. So remind yourself of those things that are listed there on the screen. But what are you looking for when you want to share the gospel with someone? You are seeking the seeker. Now, they don't come with arrows or halos or anything like that. You have to kind of put it out there and see what the response is. Look at Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, point number one, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. You're looking for people who are looking. One of the ways that you can determine that is by establishing the meaning of the importance of faith. It's a very common term. We use it religiously most often, but it's not a religious term in and of itself. It simply means what a person believes to be true. Now, by making the connection to the term worldview, and that everyone has both, gives you the opportunity to begin to explore the real crux of the issue, which is the reliability of the Bible itself. So the next step is to establish that the source of your worldview, which is why you do what you do, whether it's right or wrong or consistent or inconsistent, it's still what you believe to be true. Now, that worldview must be centered on faith in the Bible as the final say on all issues of truth. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. If they don't believe that, you just need to stop. Because now it just becomes an issue of who's the better arguer or orator or tearjerker or whatever you want to call it. If you don't agree on a standard of truth, then it really becomes irrelevant. Now, you will have to determine whether or not the person is just ignorant or they flat out reject it. And there is a difference between ignorance is just the lack of information. So you could and should be able to provide them with that information. Now, if you're teaching your children or your grandchildren, there are some things that you're going to have to get brushed up on. If you're an older person from, say, the baby boomers or even older, you're probably wondering, why in the world do I need to study about creation and evolution? Or why do I need to get details on how the canon was selected? Or because that's where it's at. You didn't have to be convinced of that because you accepted that. But we are now into the 5th or 6th decade where we don't pray in schools. We don't teach God in the classroom. As a matter of fact, we're very anti-God. So your children and grandchildren are being exposed to that, and you're going to have to get brushed up on that. And if you'd like to write me, I've got plenty of resources if you need some direction in that area. But what if somebody accepts the Bible? Well, that's pretty simple. Then let's just go, because we got more to talk about. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. If you have a person who believes that the Bible is the absolute final say on truth, then why would anybody be ashamed of that gospel? Why would that be? Well, the translation in 1 Corinthians, where Paul is talking about the same subject, he says, through the foolishness of the message preached. And to the Greeks, it was foolishness. Foolishness could also be rendered absurd. So the gospel to some is absurd. And why is that? When you compare the Bible and its explanation of God to all other religions, both past and present, The defining mark is that because the God of the Bible actually cares for his creation, unlike all other gods. He's not a trickster. He's not elusive. The Far Eastern religions don't even define God in any way, shape, or form the same way that we do. And the Middle Eastern religions, they have a God that is so far above men that he literally thumbs his nose at him and really has a disdain for him in many ways. Doesn't really care. And the evidence of that is in its history, for sure. But in all cases, mythological or otherwise, the God of the Bible stands out, and that's a major point that you want to make. And the evidence that this is true is found in the three foundational principles that we are discussing. First, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, not as a giant chessboard, not as a means to trick people, not as to play some kind of a game, but because he cared. And that's really something that's different than all other religions. The text that this centers around is in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. 3 points. Truth became suppressed. As the introduction of God came, man rejected that idea and began to cover it up with other gods, other plans. Man has ultimately no excuse. You have to accept this. Everybody in the world at some point comes into the reality that there's something bigger than they are. There is God. Now, whether they hold on to that or not is a different story. That's the person we're looking for, the seeker. And then, rather than destroying man after man's rejection of God's wonderful plan, he left them over to themselves. He said, fine, see how that works for you. And hopefully you'll recognize that your choices are not going to work in the long run. So our first point, as we looked into text number 1 out of the book of Romans, which you need to be familiar with, thoroughly familiar with, when sharing the gospel with someone else, and then identify these 3 main points in the text as they appear. So as you see them there on your screen, please take note of them. God happened, and man tried to suppress that truth. But ultimately, every man is without excuse, no matter where they live. The evidence of that is found in the creation. And then, even though they still rejected him, God said, fine, I'll turn that over to you. And you exchange the truth of God for a lie. But the intent is that God, instead of just reaching down and zapping everyone, is going to give them an opportunity to reconsider at some point. Now, in John 1:1, we see a familiar text. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, what does that clearly state? The second point, that indeed Jesus is God. And the Word was God. God became human, and that human is Jesus. Now, that's our second major point. In what religious culture can you ever find where God became a man? A frail, we have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to watch out we don't get infections, all those kinds of things. When's the last time you ever heard of a God doing that? To try to get down and empathize with us. Just doesn't happen. The text number 2, John chapter 1, has these major points in them. And notice that third point, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, the glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Become familiar with this text. Jesus is God. Notice that last line there. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus the Christ. So we have the major components that we are working for. So, why am I not ashamed? Why should I be ashamed? God is. Man has no excuse, but God didn't destroy everybody. Rather, he became a man to show that he truly cared about his creature. So then what's the logical conclusion? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Well, that makes perfectly good sense, doesn't it? Jesus is God. If you want to get to God, you got to go to God. And in this case, God came down as a human being. So Jesus is indeed the only way. No other substitution. No Buddhas, no Allahs, no nothing except for Jesus. John 14, 1 through 6. And that's the final text for our foundation. Again, you should become familiar with all of these texts, and the highlighted portions are the points to be made. So, in review, teaching the gospel. Step 2, the foundation. God is a reality. You can explore the idea of creation, morality, and history to prove that point. Jesus is God. Use different scriptures to do so, but John 1:1 is probably your most pointed. Jesus is the only way to God and all that he implies. So we have this flow idea from the foundational elements as you see there. So next time, we're going to explore the gospel as history. In other words, to say that God didn't just make this up. This was always his plan. He always had it intended that he would demonstrate in some marvelous ways that he truly cares. So, we're not ashamed of the gospel. We're not ashamed of the story of our all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing God has come down to earth to be like us, to show us that he truly cares. That's the point we want to make in lesson number 2. So, next time, we'll move on to lesson number 3, and look forward to hearing from you. You have a great day.